Reply by the author to the first set of objections. Gentlemen, you have certainly stirred up against me a mighty adversary, whose wit and learning could have given me a great deal of trouble, were it not for the fact that, being a theologian who is both pious and thoroughly civilized, he preferred championing the cause of God and any of its defenders to making a serious attack upon it. But through this minor trickery is a very fine trait in him, nonetheless, such collusion on my part would not warrant praise. And so I prefer here to expose his ruse for aiding me rather than to respond to him as if he were an adversary. First of all, he has brought together in a few words my chief argument for proving the existence of God, so that it might better remain in the reader's memory. And, having briefly indicated his assent to what he judged to be demonstrated with sufficient clarity, and having thus strengthened them with his own authority, he inquired into that single matter upon which the main difficulty rests, namely, what we are to understand here by the word idea and what cause an idea requires. I have written that an idea is the very thing thought, insofar as it exists objectively in the intellect. But he pretends to understand these words in a sense quite different from that in which I meant them, so that he can provide me an opportunity to explain them more clearly. To exist objectively in the intellect, he says, is to terminate the act of the intellect after the manner of an object. This characterization is surely an extrinsic denomination, and it has no bearing on the thing itself. Note that he is referring to the thing itself insofar as it exists outside the intellect. Seen in this light, it certainly is an extrinsic denomination for the thing to exist objectively in the intellect. But I was talking about an idea which is never outside the intellect, and thus objective existence merely means that the thing exists in the intellect in just the way that objects normally exist in the intellect. Thus, for example, were a person to ask what happens to the sun as a result of its existing objectively in my intellect, the best answer would be that nothing happens to it except an extrinsic denomination, to wit, that the sun terminates the operation of the intellect after the manner of an object. But were one to ask what the idea of the sun is, and were the answer that it is the very thing thought insofar as it exists objectively in the intellect, no one would take it to be the very sun itself insofar as that extrinsic denomination is in it. Nor will objective existence in the intellect signify that it terminates the operation of the intellect after the manner of an object, but rather that it is in the intellect in the manner in which its objects normally exist in it, surely not formally, as it is in the heavens, but objectively, that is, in the way in which objects normally exist in the intellect. Clearly, this mode of existence is definitely far less perfect than that mode of existence by which things exist outside the intellect. But it is not for that reason simply nothing, as I have already written. And when this most learned theologian declares that there is an equivocation in these words, he seems to have wanted to warn me about what I have just now noted, lest, perhaps, I not be mindful of it. For he says first that a thing existing thus in the intellect through an idea is not an actual being. That is, it is not something existing outside the intellect. This is true. Then he also says that objective being is not something conjured up in the mind or a being or reason, but something real which is distinctly conceived. With these words he admits all that I have assumed. But he still makes the further point that since it is merely conceived and is not actual, that is because it is merely an idea and not something existing outside the intellect, though it can indeed be conceived, it can hardly be caused. That is, it does not need a cause in order to exist outside the intellect. I grant this. But it clearly does not need a cause in order to be conceived, and the point at issue is with respect to this cause alone. Thus, Were one to have in one's intellect an idea of a machine devised with the greatest of skill, one indeed could with justification ask what the cause is of that idea. Now, it will not suffice for one to declare that the idea is nothing outside of the mind, and thus cannot be caused, but only conceived. For all that is asked for here is what the cause is in virtue of which it is conceived. Nor again will it suffice to say that the intellect is itself the cause, insofar as it is the cause of its operation. For regarding this cause there can be no doubt, but only regarding the cause of the objective skill, which is in the idea. For it ought to be the result of some cause that this idea of a machine contains this objective skill, rather than some other, and the objective skill of this idea of the machine is in the same relationship to the idea of the machine as the objective reality of the idea of God is to the idea of God. And surely various things could be reckoned to be the cause of this skill. Either some such real machine has been seen beforehand, in accordance with whose likeness the idea has been formed, or a great knowledge of mechanics which is in this intellect, or perhaps a great subtlety of mind by which one might even invent the machine without any previous knowledge. Note that all the skill that exists merely objectively in this idea ought necessarily to exist either formally or eminently in its cause. Whatever that cause finally turns out to be it a formal cause or an eminent cause, and the same thing is to be reckoned even with respect to the objective reality which is in the idea of God. But in what will such a reality thus exist, except in a God who really exists? But the insightful gentleman has seen all these things quite well, and therefore admits that one can ask, why a given idea has this objective reality rather than that one. To this question he responds, first, that what I wrote regarding the triangle holds for all ideas, namely, that even if perhaps the triangle exists nowhere in the world, still its determinate nature, essence, or form is immutable and eternal. Indeed, he declares that this requires no cause, but this reply does not seem satisfactory. For though the nature of the triangle is immutable and eternal, nevertheless it is not therefore any less incumbent upon us to ask why the idea of a triangle is in us. Thus he added by way of a postscript that if I insist upon a reason, it is the imperfection of our intellect, and so on. By this answer, he seems to have wanted to show merely that those who wished to disagree with me in this matter offer no answer that has any semblance of truth about it. For it is certainly no more probable that the reason why there exists in us an idea of God is the imperfection of our intellect, than that the lack of experience in mechanics is the cause of our imagining some very skillfully made machine, rather than some other less perfect machine. On the contrary, were one to have an idea of a machine in which every conceivable skill is contained, the most appropriate inference is that this idea issued from some cause in which every conceivable skill really existed, even though in the idea it existed only objectively. And for the same reason, since we have in us an idea of God in which every conceivable perfection is contained, it can then most manifestly be concluded that this idea depends upon some cause in which there is also all this perfection, namely in a God who really exists. Nor does there seem more difficulty in the one case than in the other. Just as not all are experts in mechanics, and thus cannot have ideas of very skillfully produced machines, so too not all have the same power of conceiving the idea of God. However, since this idea has been implanted in the minds of all in the same way, and since we never observe that it comes to us from anywhere but ourselves, we assume that it pertains to the nature of our intellect. Surely none of this is incorrect. But we are leaving out something else that is especially in need of consideration, something on which the whole force and lucidity lucidity of this argument depend, namely, that this power of having within oneself the idea of God cannot be in our intellect, were this intellect merely a finite being, as in fact it is, and did it not have God as its cause. And thus I inquired further whether I could exist if God did not exist, and not so much to offer a proof different from the preceding one, but rather to explain the very same proof more fully. But here the gentleman, by being excessively obliging, has placed me in an awkward position, for he compares my argument with another one drawn from St. Thomas and Aristotle, with the result that he seems to demand a reason, when I set out on the same path as these two, why I did not follow it in all respects, but I beg him to allow me to give an account of those things which I myself have written, and to be silent about what others have written. And so, first of all, I have not based my argument on my having observed a certain order or succession of efficient causes in the realm of sensible things. For one thing, I thought it much more evident that God exists than that any sensible thing exists. For another thing, the only conclusion I seemed able to arrive at was that I ought to acknowledge the imperfection of my intellect, given that, admittedly, I could not comprehend how an infinite number of such causes succeeded one another in such a way that none of them was first. For certainly, from the fact that I could not comprehend this, it does not follow that one of them ought to be a first cause, any more than it follows from the fact that I cannot also comprehend the infinite divisions in a finite quantity, that there is a final division, such that it cannot be divided further. All that follows is that my intellect, which is finite, does not grasp the infinite. Thus I preferred to use my own existence as the foundation of my argument, since my existence depends on no series of causes, and is so well known to me that nothing else could be more well known. And, in order to free myself from the whole problem of the succession of causes, I asked concerning myself, not so much what the cause was by which I was at one time produced, as the cause by which I am being conserved at the present time. Next, I inquired about the cause of myself, not in so far as I am composed of mind and body, but only and precisely in so far as I am a thing that thinks. I believe that this is quite relevant to the matter at hand, for in so doing I have been able to free myself much more effectively from prejudices, to attend to the light of nature, to question myself, and to affirm as certain that there cannot be anything within me of which I am not somehow aware. This approach is clearly different from seeing that I was begotten by my father, and concluding from this that he in turn was begotten by my grandfather, and from putting an end to my search by declaring that some cause is first, because in seeking the parents of parents I could not go on to infinity. Moreover, I inquired about the cause of myself, not merely in so far as I am a thing that thinks, but most especially and primarily in so far as I observe that, among my other thoughts, there is within me the idea of a supremely perfect being. On this one point hangs the entire force of my demonstration. First, because in this idea is contained what God is, at least in so far as he can be understood by me, and, according to the rules of the true logic, one should never ask whether something exists unless one first understands what it is. Second, because it is this very idea which gives me the opportunity to examine whether I am derived from myself or from something else, as well as to acknowledge my defects. And lastly, because this idea is what teaches not only that something is the cause of me, but also that in this cause are contained all perfections, and hence that this cause is God. Finally, I did not say that it is impossible for something to be the efficient cause of itself. For though this obviously is the case when the term efficient cause is restricted to those causes which are temporally prior to their effects or are different from them, still it does not seem that such a restriction is appropriate in this inquiry. First, the inquiry would be pointless, for who does not know that the same thing can neither exist prior to itself nor be different from itself. Second, the light of nature does not stipulate that the nature of an efficient cause requires that it be temporally prior to its effect. On the contrary, a thing does not bear the trademark of a cause except during the time it is producing an effect, and thus it is not prior to the effect. However, the light of nature does surely stipulate that there exists nothing about which it is inappropriate to ask why it exists or to inquire into its efficient cause, or, if it has none, to demand to know why it does not need one. Thus, if I believed that nothing could in any respect stand in relation to itself the way an efficient cause stands to its effect, it is utterly out of the question that I should then conclude that something is the first cause. On the contrary, I should again ask for the cause of what was called the first cause, and thus I would never arrive at anything that was the first cause of all things. But I do readily admit that there could exist something in which there is such a great and inexhaustible power that it never needs the help of anything in order to exist. Nor again does it now need a cause in order to be conserved. Thus, in a manner of speaking, it is the cause of itself. And I understand God to be such a cause. For even if I had existed from all eternity, and thus nothing existed prior to me, nevertheless, considering the fact that the parts of time can be separated one from another, and thus from the fact that I now exist, it does not follow that I will exist in the future unless some cause were, so to speak, to remake me over and over at each individual moment in time. I would not hesitate to call that cause which conserves me an efficient cause. Thus, even though there has never been a time when God did not exist, nevertheless, because it is He who truly conserves Himself, it does not seem wholly inappropriate to call God the cause of Himself. Still, we should note here that by conservation, we do not mean the sort of conservation that takes place through any positive influence on the part of an efficient cause, but only that the very essence of God is such that God must always exist. On the basis of these considerations, it will be easy for me to reply to the distinction drawn with respect to the expression derived from itself. An expression, the very learned theologian warns me, that requires an explanation. For some people, attending only to the strict and literal meaning of efficient cause, think it impossible for something to be the efficient cause of itself, and do not discern here a place for any other type of cause analogous to an efficient cause. When these people say that something is derived from itself, they are in the habit of understanding only that it has no cause. Nevertheless, if these very same people were of a mind to pay more attention to the facts than to words, they would easily observe that the negative rendering of the expression derived from itself proceeds merely from the imperfection of the human intellect, and has no foundation in reality. But there is another rendering, a positive one, which has been sought from the truth of things, and from which alone my argument proceeds. For were one to believe, for example, that some body were derived from itself, one may simply mean that it has no cause. Now, it is not the case that one affirms this on the basis of some positive consideration, but only negatively, in the sense that one fails to recognize the cause of the body, but this is a certain imperfection in oneself, as one will easily come to find out for oneself later when one considers that the parts of time do not depend one upon another. Thus, the fact that this body is presumed up into the present time to have been derived from itself, that is, it has no cause, does not suffice to make it also exist in the future, unless there is in it some power which, as it were, continuously remakes it. For then, seeing that no such power is contained in the idea of a body, one immediately gathers from this that this body is not derived from itself, taking the expression derived from itself in a positive sense. In like manner, when we say that God is derived from himself, we surely can also understand this negatively. that is, such that the entire meaning of the expression is that he has no cause. But if we have previously asked why God exists or why he continues to exist, and on noting the immense and incomprehensible power which is contained in the idea of God, we acknowledged that this power is so overwhelming that it is clearly the cause of God's continuing to exist, and that nothing but this can be the cause. Then we are saying that God is derived from himself. This no longer in a this no longer in a negative sense, but in a thoroughly positive sense. For though we need not say that God is the efficient cause of himself, lest perhaps we be arguing about words, still, because we perceive that his being derived from himself, or his having no cause, different from himself, is itself derived not from nothing, but from a real immensity of power. It is wholly fitting for us to think that God stands in the same relationship to himself as an efficient cause does to its effect, and thus that God is derived from himself positively, and it is also fitting for each person to ask himself whether he is derived from himself in the same sense. On finding in himself no power sufficient to conserve him through even a moment of time, he rightly concludes that he is derived from another. And this is surely derived from something else which is derived from itself. Because this inquiry cannot go on to infinity, since it is a question here of the present and not of the past or the future. In fact, I will also add here something I have not put in writing before, namely, that it is not even a secondary cause at which one arrives, but certainly that cause in which there is enough power to conserve something existing outside it, and a fortiori conserves itself by its own power, and thus is derived from itself. However, when it is said that every limitation is derived from a cause, I believe something true is being understood, but it is not expressed in very appropriate terms, and the difficulty is not resolved. For, strictly speaking, limitation is merely the negation of a further perfection, and this negation is not derived from a cause, but is the very thing being limited. However, even if it were true that everything is limited by a cause, still it is not self-evident, but must be proved some other way. For, as the subtle-theologian very well replies, anything can be thought to be limited either in the way just mentioned or in virtue of the fact that it pertains to its nature, just as it is of the nature of the triangle that it is composed of no more than 3 lines. However, what does seem self-evident to me is that everything that exists is derived either from a cause or from itself as from a cause. For since we understand not only existence but also the negation of existence, we cannot pretend that anything is derived from itself without there being some reason why it should exist rather than not. In other words, we should not interpret the expression derived from itself so as to mean as from a cause, in view of the overwhelming fullness of power which can easily be demonstrated to be in God alone. What the gentleman does finally grant me is something that hardly allows of any doubt, but which commonly is hardly ever given serious consideration. It is of such importance for plucking the whole of philosophy from out of the shadows that he helps me greatly in my project by confirming it with his authority. But here he judiciously asks whether I know the infinite clearly and distinctly. For although I have tried to anticipate this objection, still it occurs so spontaneously to everyone that it is worth responding to it at some length. And so, to begin with, I will declare here that the infinite qua infinite is in no way comprehended. Nonetheless, it is still understood, insofar as understanding clearly and distinctly that a thing is such that plainly no limits can be found in it is tantamount to understanding clearly that it is infinite. And indeed, I do distinguish here between indefinite and infinite. Strictly speaking, I designate only that thing to be infinite in which no limits of any kind are found. In this sense, God alone is infinite. However, there are things in which I discern no limit, but only in a certain respect, such as the extension of imaginary space, a series of numbers, the divisibility of the parts of a quantity, and the like. These I call indefinite, but not infinite, since such things do not lack a limit in every respect. Moreover, I distinguish between the formal meaning of infinite or infinity and the thing that is infinite. For as far as infinity is concerned, even if we understand that it is positive in the highest degree, nevertheless we understand we understand it only in a certain negative fashion, because it depends on our not noticing any limitation in the thing. But as to the thing itself, which is infinite, although our understanding of the thing is surely positive, still it is not adequate. That is, we do not comprehend all that is capable of being understood in it. But were we to turn our eyes toward the sea, even though we neither grasp the whole thing in our sight nor traverse its great vastness, nevertheless we are said to see it. And were we to view the sea from a distance, so as to take it in all at once, as it were, with our eyes, we see it only in a confused fashion, just as we have a confused image of a chiliagon when we take in all of its sides at the same time. But were we to direct our gaze at close quarters towards some portion of the sea, such a sight can be very clear and distinct, just as would be the case with imagining a chiliagon, were our vision restricted to merely one or other of the chiliagon sides. By a similar line of reasoning, I grant, as do all the theologians, that God cannot be grasped by the human intellect, and that he cannot be distinctly known by those who gaze upon him, as it were from afar, and try mentally to grasp him whole and all at once. This is the sense in which St. Thomas declared in the text cited that the knowledge of God is present in us merely in a certain confused manner. But those who try to take notice of each of God's perfections one by one, and try not so much to grasp them as to be grasped by them, and to engage all the powers of their intellect in contemplating them, will surely find that God is a much fuller and easier subject matter for clear and distinct knowledge than are any created things. Nor in that text did St. Thomas deny this, as is obvious from his affirming in the following article that the existence of God can be demonstrated. However, wherever I claimed that God could be clearly and distinctly known, I had in mind only the aforementioned knowledge, which is finite and proportionate to the humble modality of our mind. Besides, it was not necessary to have a different understanding of the matter in order to establish the truth of what I have claimed, as will be readily apparent if one takes note of the fact that I said this is in just two places. The first place was where there was a question of whether there is contained in the idea that we form of God anything real or just the negation of something real. Just as perhaps is the case in the idea of cold, where there is nothing more than the negation of heat, a matter about which there can be no doubt. The second place was where I claimed that existence belongs to no less to no less to the nature of a being that is supremely perfect than having three sides belongs to the nature of a triangle, a fact that can also be understood without an adequate knowledge of God. Here, again, he compares one of my arguments with another from St. Thomas, in order to compel me, as it were, to specify just what greater force is to be found in the one argument rather than in the other. Now I seem able to do this without any great degree of vexatiousness, since St. Thomas did not use this argument as his own, nor did he draw the same conclusion as I do. Consequently, I am not at variance here on any point with the angelic doctor, for his question was whether the proposition God exists is self-evident to us, that is, whether it is obvious to everyone. He denies that it is, and rightly so, but the argument he puts to himself can be stated thus: when we understand what is signified by the word God, we understand it to signify that than which a greater cannot be signified. But to exist in reality as well as in the intellect is greater than to exist merely in the intellect. Therefore, when we understand what is signified by the word God, we understand that what is being signified is that God exists in reality as well as in the intellect. There is an obvious flaw in the form of this argument, for the only conclusion he should have drawn is, therefore, when we understand what the word God signifies, we understand that God exists in reality as well as in the intellect. But merely being signified by a word does not automatically make what is signified to be true. But my argument went as follows. What we clearly and distinctly understand to belong to the true and immutable nature or essence or form of a thing can truly be affirmed of that thing. But after having investigated with sufficient care what God is, we clearly and distinctly understand that it belongs to his true and immutable nature that he exists. Thus, we can, at that point, rightfully affirm of God that he exists. At least we now have a validly drawn conclusion. Moreover, we cannot deny the major premise, since we have already granted that everything we clearly and distinctly understand is true. We are left with only the minor premise, and here I confess there is no little difficulty. One reason for this is that we are so accustomed to distinguishing existence from essence in the case of all other things, that we do not sufficiently take notice of the extent to which existence belongs more to the essence of God than to the essence of other things. Second, by failing to distinguish what belongs to the true and immutable essence of a thing from what is ascribed to it merely by a construction on the part of the intellect, even if we take sufficient notice of the fact that existence belongs to the essence of God, we do not then conclude that God exists, because we do not know whether God's essence is immutable and true, or whether it is merely an artifact of our own making. But in order to remove the first part of this difficulty, we must distinguish between possible and necessary existence. We must also take note of the fact that possible existence is contained in the concept or idea of everything that is clearly and distinctly understood, but in no instance is necessary existence so contained, except in the case of the idea of God. For those who pay close attention to the difference between the idea of God and all other ideas will no doubt perceive that even though we surely understand other things only as existing, it still does not follow from this that they do exist, but only that they can exist, because we do not understand it to be necessary that actual existence be joined with the other properties of these things, but from the fact that we understand that actual existence is necessarily and always joined with God's other attributes, it readily follows that God exists. Next, in order to remove the remaining part of this difficulty, we must take notice of the fact that those ideas which do not contain true and immutable natures, but natures that are mere constructions devised by the intellect, can be divided by the very same intellect, not merely by an act of abstraction, but by a clear and distinct operation. As a consequence, what cannot be divided thus by the intellect surely was not devised by the intellect. For example, when I think of a winged horse or an actually existing lion or a triangle inscribed in a square, I easily understand that I could just as well think of a horse without wings or a non-existent lion or a triangle apart from a square, and so on. As a consequence, these things do not have true and immutable natures. But if I think of a triangle or a square, I leave the lion and the horse out of the discussion here because their natures are not plainly evident to us. Then certainly, whatever I discern as being contained in the idea of a triangle, such as that its three angles are equal to two right angles and so on, I will rightfully affirm of the triangle. The same holds for the square with regard to whatever I find in the idea of a square. For though I could understand a triangle while abstracting from the fact that its three angles are equal to two right angles, still I cannot deny this of the triangle by a clear and distinct operation, that is, while correctly understanding what I am saying. Moreover, if I consider a triangle inscribed in a square, not with the purpose of attributing to the square what pertains solely to the triangle, or to the triangle what belongs solely to the square, but without the purpose of examining only what arises out of the conjunction of the two together, the nature of this conjunction will be no less true and immutable than that of the square alone or the triangle alone. And thus it will be appropriate to affirm that the area of the square is not less than double the area of the triangle inscribed in it, and to affirm other similar properties that pertain to the nature of this composite figure. But if I were to think that existence is contained in the idea of a body that is supremely perfect because it is a greater perfection to exist in reality as well as in the intellect than to exist in the intellect alone, I cannot for that reason conclude that this supremely perfect body exists, but only that it can exist, for I am sufficiently cognizant both of the fact that this idea had been devised by my own intellect, which has joined together all bodily perfections, as well as of the fact that existence does not arise from the other bodily perfections, since existence can just as easily be denied or affirmed of them. In fact, in examining the idea of a body, I perceive that there is no power existing in it by means of which a body produces or conserves itself. From this, I rightly conclude that necessary existence, which alone is in question here, no more belongs to the nature of a body, supremely perfect though it may be, than it belongs to the nature of a mountain not to have a valley, or to the nature of a triangle to have angles whose sum is greater than two right angles. However, if we now ask not about a body, but about a thing that has all the perfections that can exist together, and without any regard for the sort of thing it may finally turn out to be, and if we inquire whether existence is to be counted among these perfections, on first blush, we surely will be in some doubt. The reason for this is that since our mind, which is finite, is accustomed to ponder these perfections only one by one, it perhaps does not immediately notice how necessary is the conjunction between them. However, were we to examine carefully whether existence belongs to a being which is supremely powerful and what kind of existence it is, we will be able to perceive clearly and distinctly first that at least possible existence belongs to such a being, just as it belongs to all other beings, just as it belongs to all other things, of which there is a distinct idea in us, even to those things which are devised through a construction on the part of the intellect. Next, since we cannot think the existence of this being to be possible unless at the same time, taking note of its immense power, we acknowledge that this being can exist by its own power. We here conclude that this being truly exists and has existed from all eternity, for it is very obvious by the light of nature that what can exist by its very own power always exists, and thus we will understand that necessary existence is contained in the idea of a supremely powerful being, not by virtue of a construction on the part of the intellect, but because it belongs to the true and immutable nature of such a being that it exists. And thus we shall easily perceive that this being, which is supremely perfect, must have in itself all the other perfections that are contained in the idea of God, such that, by their very nature, and without any construction on the part of the intellect, they are all joined together and exist in God. All of these points are readily apparent to one who pays careful attention, and they differ from what I have previously written only in the manner of their explanation, which I have deliberately altered, so that I might suit a wide variety of minds. Nor will I here deny that this argument is such that those who do not recall all of what constitutes its proof will easily take it to be a sophism. Thus, at the outset I did have considerable doubts about whether I ought to use it, lest perhaps I should provide those who might not grasp the argument with an occasion for disavowing the remaining arguments as well. However, because there are but two ways by which one can prove that God exists, namely the one through effects and the other through God's essence or nature, and because I explained the former as best I could in the third meditation, I did not believe that the latter argument ought to be overlooked later on. As far as the formal distinction is concerned, which the very learned the sorry, as far as the formal distinction is concerned, which the very learned theologian draws from Duns Scotus, I declare briefly that a formal distinction does not differ from a model distinction, and that it applies only to incomplete beings, which I have carefully distinguished from complete beings. Moreover, it surely suffices for a formal distinction that one thing be conceived distinctly and separately from another by an act of abstraction on the part of the intellect inadequately conceiving the thing, yet not so distinctly and separately that we understand each one as something existing in its own right and different from every other thing. For this to be the case, a real distinction is absolutely required. Thus, for example, the distinction between the motion and the shape of the same body is a formal one. I can understand perfectly well the motion apart from the shape and the shape apart from the motion, and either in abstraction from the body. Nevertheless, I still cannot completely understand the motion apart from the thing in which the motion takes place, or even the shape apart from the thing which has the shape. Moreover, I cannot imagine motion existing in a thing in which there can be no shape, nor a shape existing in a thing which cannot move. In the same way, I cannot understand justice apart from someone who is just, or mercy apart from someone who is merciful. Nor can I imagine that that very same person who is just is incapable of being merciful. But I completely understand what a body is when I think that it merely has extension and shape, is capable of moving, and so on. And I deny that there is anything whatsoever in it that belongs to the nature of the mind. Conversely, I understand that the mind is a complete thing which doubts, understands, wills, and so on, even though I deny that there is anything in it that is contained in the idea of a body. This would be utterly impossible were there not a real distinction between mind and body. These, dear gentlemen, are the answers that I have made to the very helpful and intelligent observations of your friend. If I have not yet satisfied him in regard to these observations, I ask that he put me on notice as to what is either lacking or in error. If I might seek this from him through you, I will hold it a great kindness.